Hello to all our working preachers out there. This is Joy J. Moore. Our spring campaign is off to an amazing start. I am grateful for all the people who have stepped up to support this work. Your support provides a new narrative lectionary podcast each week for preachers across the globe. Your gifts make an immediate impact for millions of people at a time when it is so desperately needed. We need your support during this campaign to ensure these resources continue to be available for free for our users. A gift of $150 will provide one new narrative lectionary podcast. Any gift to the spring campaign will grant you access to additional content from the Sermon Brainwave team at Festival of Homiletics. Go to workingpreacher.org before May 31st to double your impact and have your gift matched dollar for dollar. Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Joy J. Moore.
And me, Matt Skinner.
And me, Karoline Lewis.
This podcast is for the sixth Sunday of Easter, which falls on May 22nd, 2022. Our first reading is Acts chapter 16, verses 9 through 15. Our psalm is number 67. The second reading is from Revelation chapter 21, verse 10, and then 22 through 22, verse 5. And then our gospel reading will be from the 14th chapter of John, verses 23 through 29.
Ooh. A lot of 22s there, 20s.
20, 22, 22, 22.
Yeah.
So my T's got spoken today.
Yeah, that's good. Here we are moving along in the farewell discourse. Again, the one thing that I would recommend for preachers maybe is we're going to get the previous verses or some of the previous verses of chapter 14 for Pentecost this year. So to look forward, and Pentecost is chapter 14, 8 through 17. And then you have alternate verses of 25 through 27, which is part of our lection for today. And so you get the first giving of the Spirit in before the verses that are selected for today. So I would maybe start at verse 18 because these are the verses that are then left out of the lectionary, and then lead you into what Jesus is introducing here in particular. And verse 18, I will not leave you orphaned. I am coming to you. In a little while, you will no longer see me. And of course, this whole tension in this section of the discourse between Jesus' absence and his departure of leaving them, and yet the introduction of the Paraclete. And so it's into that reality of Jesus' departure and Jesus leaving, then is the promise of the Paraclete, which we'll talk about more when we get to Pentecost. But here I want to focus first on verse 27, which is the first time in the farewell discourse that the word peace is used by Jesus. And that kind of what I talked about last week, that this is not like the commentary does a really nice job too of talking about what kind of peace this is. But it's a peace that Jesus gives and leaves in the midst of this reality of him leaving and departing. And so how does that then land on the ears of the disciples? So that's kind of what I want a preacher to do, is to think about the rhetorical effect of hearing peace in the midst of do not let your hearts be troubled, do not let them be afraid. I am not leaving you orphaned. Jesus has already said, I am leaving. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And Thomas is like, we don't know the way. And yes, I am the way. I mean, how to set that up. And then rhetorically, what does peace, think about how peace feels before you explain it or try to preach it. And that's because that's really the dynamic here. Peace will be mentioned again in chapter 16 of the farewell discourse, and then then that peace is carried forward into the resurrection appearance, the first resurrection appearance to the disciples in chapter 20. And so when Jesus comes into that space in that locked room, that locked place where they are, that when Jesus enters into that and says peace, that the entirety of the farewell discourse is also brought forward in that moment. And so if that's one homiletical move you can make, is to talk about peace and the effect of peace here in the farewell discourse, that then you could also bring in that moment of fear and that the disciples feel after the crucifixion, and yet peace comes again to them. So that's the first thought I have about this passage. Only the first, indeed, only the first.
that rhetorical strategy of anticipating the next time that this is going to come up in that moment, where this moment becomes an echo, so that moment has meaning. So I'm going to confess, as I ended last week, I wouldn't preach from John this week, because this would be the week I would preach from Revelation, just a heads up. But if I were going to preach from John, I'd love what you're doing, and I do it that way. And I would focus from this idea that this isn't the world's peace. This isn't what we think peace should look like, feel like, or how it should arrive. And I think that's what you've brilliantly described, Karoline.
So I think I have a difference of opinion with both of you about verse 27. So I think the contrast here is not about the quality of peace or the nature of peace. I think it's about the giving of the peace, with that the way that the just as works there. In other words, I think it's adverbial and not adjectival. It's about, so I would want the contrast to look more about what are the conditions by which the world offers peace or provides peace, and what does it mean to be offered peace in an unconditional way or in a free gift or abundant kind of way from Jesus. But we don't have to belabor that. I
didn't hear the disagreement.
Oh, I think we're talking about the same kind of peace. I think it's the terms by which peace is given that he's contrasting.
Love it. Okay, I'm in a real loving mood today. I got to be careful about it.
No, it's fine. But we can keep going.
We're going to keep going?
That's where I would go. If I were preaching on it, if I were to
John?
choose this over, say, an Acts passage or a Revelation passage, that's where I'd head.
Well, and I think, I think it's an important distinction. And if you go down that direction of peace, I mean, that, the next time that Jesus talks about this peace in 16:33, I said this to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you face persecution, but take courage. I have conquered the world. And so that reminder of peace, again, rhetorically, happens at the very end of the farewell discourse, because then you move into the high priestly prayer. And so that there is this contrast, but that giving of peace has this kind of effect. That's kind of what I was, that giving of peace has a kind of effect on you that we're supposed to feel. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's, you know, it's hard to create peace for yourself, at least when we're talking about hostilities, right? Peace has to be given. It's usually the most powerful party that has the ability to grant peace or not. And so, yeah, you're going to face persecutions in this world, right? There's a price to be paid for peace that a lot of people have to pay to an oppressor or to an abuser. And so the promise here is that one peace given freely by somebody who really expects nothing in return, or at least there's no cost up front, so to speak.
Yeah.
Who has experienced the betrayal and the persecution and the denial, and yet still offers the peace.
I think another direction here I would that intrigues me is the verse 23, those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. The word there, home, it's not the same word as Revelation from last week. That was a skene, tent. And this is monain, which is comes from meno, which is, of course, John's favorite word, or one of John's favorite word is meno, to abide. And so the way in which this promise of that, it could be another direction that part of what the resurrection means, at least for John, is really the promise of the ascension, where Jesus will prepare an abiding place, from John 14:2, not a room, not a mansion, but a mene, abiding place. And so that it's to make our home with them is that affirmation of the ongoing relationship with Jesus and with God that looking around looks like it's in jeopardy, or what's about to unfold. It could be that relationship is in trouble. And yet that's going to be the affirmation, is that the resurrection is a step toward that, loving them to the end of preparing that, making home, making that abiding place with Jesus and God and believers.
Appreciate that. I love that. I love how you weave all this back together. You want to point us to the Acts text?
Yeah.
Sure. So Acts 16, this is where we meet Lydia, who is an important character in the book of Acts, probably because she gets more attention than most other women in Acts, and there are very few, but she also is, I think, a character who is very difficult to characterize in a clear way. And so a lot of interpretations of Lydia have really staked some of their power on certain things about her that we probably want to investigate. Like most people think she's wealthy, and she's not necessarily wealthy. And I was teaching Acts several months ago last winter, and had students leading discussions on passages, and the person in my class who was working on Lydia really pushed that question to ask people, why do you need her to be wealthy and successful and independent for this story to have power for you? Because a lot of people kind of led with that. I think one thing that is pretty clear is she does appear to be an outsider, in at least this place of prayer that she and other women are going to is outside of the city walls. Or outside of the gate. And that might not be because they simply like nature. It might be because there's no place for them to worship within the city. One clue of that is later on, when Paul and Silas are arrested, the charge against them is going to be an anti-Jewish charge, and Lydia is appears to be worshiping the God of Israel, right? So there could be a sign that the author sees Philippi as a dangerous place for Jews or for Jewish worship, and maybe particularly for women who are either God-fearers or who are Jews. I don't know. That's just kind of a place to go in terms of how we characterize this person, who's obviously important because she's a paragon of hospitality. She's the first convert in Philippi. She is not named in connection with a man, of course. So I don't know. What do you two see in it? What's the significance in it? And she might be wealthy, but she also might not be. It's just not really clear. And she's not from there. She's from Thyatira, and she's from a region called Lydia, which is also interesting, that maybe she doesn't even really have a name, except, she's that lady from Lydia. It might be another nod to the fact that she is not local and not an insider.
Well, I think, those levels of details, I think, are important in that regard, Matt, of study of where she's from. Yes, in the region of Asia, Lydia. And so this outsider, and then at the same time, that you were talking about last week, of this act of hospitality, that when she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home. And she prevailed upon us. And so you have this beautiful moment of the activity of God, right? The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly. God, reaching beyond, going back to Acts 1:8, witnesses to the ends of the earth. And that this moment of hearts opened and baptism then leads to this little community moment of around, of hospitality. And that I think that's an important connection for people to make, is that these moments of realization, or these moments of conversion, like my Bible calls it the conversion of Lydia. I don't know that she's really converted here. Well, I guess maybe, but I don't know. That's a problematic word anyway. But this moment of hearts opened leads to hospitality, reciprocity, mutuality, leads to community. It's not for the sake of I don't know. It's not for the sake of it's for the sake of hospitality. And I think there's something really lovely in that. Sometimes we make, particularly, I think, with the book of Acts, this sort of grandiose mission of, Peter and then Paul and their incredible acts, as we've talked about, but just this glimpse into community and hospitality that is really private, but then we get to be a part of that. It's just, I find that to be really beautiful.
Sometimes we miss the fact that it's harder to be in community in a very familiar small space than it is on a huge stage with a grand audience before you. It's nice to be loved by the masses, but can you extend hospitality to the people who know you the best and you know them? And there's a piece of that here. Karoline, you know that you introduced to me this pattern in the Gospel of John, of where there's an encounter with Jesus by a man and then an encounter with Jesus by a woman. Joe Green pointed that out for me in the book of Luke, where there's that same sense of an encounter between the powerful and then the powerful that's named and the less powerful or unnamed. And Matt, you're bringing us into this text the way you did just caused me to see that in Romans. And Karoline, you just did this too, of saying, Peter and Paul and Lydia. We've got these stories right here that go back and forth of the same encounter of changing our lives in this book of Acts, that are the acts of the followers of Jesus. And I think what you led with, Matt, invites us to recognize that when you tell a story in this way, you can tell it for whatever is the imagination of your listeners. So if your listeners believe women are absent, then point out, here's a woman. If your listeners believe that the only way to be successful or to be recognized as to be successful and rich. Well, there's a way of reading this that maybe that's exactly who Lydia is. And I think what your student called up in the question or in the challenge is that us? Is that our imagination that says that this is the only way that you can matter? And I think where we are in this moment is realizing is that our humanity is not in our, oh, great, sorry about that. Our humanity is not in our success or riches. And so maybe Lydia isn't all that in our understanding of success, but nonetheless, what she enables is an encounter with Jesus changes how you extend hospitality to others. So no matter how you read this story, it conveys the same challenging message.
Right. And if you have an it to make her a paradigm for something or someone's or some group, that's going to tell you a lot about your own your own longings, and also about some of the types of stories the Bible just simply lacks taken as a whole. And we should point out too, if people are interested in spending more time in Acts 16, that next week you'll have another story where a woman is front and center, a young woman who's not named, who clearly does not have her own vocation. In fact, her vocation or her value is taken from her in that story. So there is interesting contrast between two characters that, if you're looking for a two-part series, here you go. The life and times in the colony of Philippi.
Very much so.
That's a teaser for next week's podcast.
For next week, and a recognition also of how preaching through this book of Acts can allow us to tell that continuing story. I've already turned my hand on this, so what I would say about this psalm is I would use it as a benediction.
Exactly what I was going to say, Joy. I mean, it's where, may God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine upon us. I mean, that's, that is a blessing or benediction in many liturgical traditions. And so just use it as the blessing, the benediction. Yep.
Or a call to worship.
Or call. Or both. I would anticipate it in any of the text, because I think we've talked about what does God's presence and face shining upon us look like. And it looks like hospitality. It looks like the peace that is given to us. So whatever text is chosen, I would anticipate it. But I appreciate that, Matt. Using it either as the call to worship, I said the benediction as Karoline did, or somebody yelled in both.
Mm-hmm. And then talk to your choir director about doing Peter, Luke, and the Lord bless you and keep you. But that's
Karoline's Lutheran. They don't do calls to worship. So,
that is not true. I always did calls to worship when I was doing worship planning.
Is that right? All right. Well,
that's because I'm a California Lutheran, and then I was a Lutheran in the South. So yeah, we do things differently there.
Good. Glad to know. Please don't send me emails if you think that I think that no Lutherans do calls to worship.
This is just a continuation of my education to understand these differences.
Yes.
So,
Revelation, we know Joy's, that's where Joy's going to be.
You know that's where I'm going to be. And anticipating these verses, particularly from 10:22 on, but anticipating that from the first 6 verses that were the text from last week. Just this, and again, anticipating the psalm is, this is the week that I would turn full attention to the promise that this Revelation text offers. This is the gracious presence of God. This is what it looks like when God's face shines upon us. This is where abundant life is. And it looks like a city. It looks like the fullness that honors every nation. It is where there are no more lies or loopholes, but there is life. And it is made possible by the Lamb of God. And the words from verse 1 and 6 through 6 is finished up here, where there's no need for the sun or any light. I started preaching this back when I would say there wasn't even a glow in the dark Harry Potter sticker. That God's presence is filling all of the dark spaces with the fullness of light, and that is the fullness of life. And that we turn back to the opening story of creation, where there's the river that runs through it, and that it flows from the throne of God and the throne of the Lamb. It just, in this one text, which is why I said this is where I would preach it, you can tell the entire scope of the promise of God from creation to new creation that is woven through the story of Israel and demonstrated in the life of Jesus. And I would just anticipate, and if somebody invited me to preach, that's what they would get this week.
Now they know they've got the summary in advance.
They can steal it. That's what this is all about.
Yeah, it was our friend Alan Paget who first helped me really appreciate the way in which it's like you said, it's a city. It's also Eden, but it's a city that's now at peace with nature. And there's this kind of beautiful interweaving of that. I mean, not only is it a city that has people from all over the world who gather, and so it's an urban setting, but a incredibly diverse urban setting, right? It's a gathering place of all of the nations, but there's also this really interesting way in which a population center has been able to thrive in a kind of harmonious relationship with nature and a healing relationship with nature, which of course, one of the stories of the history of civilization is we've not been typically very good at that, especially when it comes to things like who has access to resources, who suffers the most from environmental degradation, and those types of questions as well.
And I think too, I think that's such an important, beautiful aspect of this passage. And then to add on to that, the detail, I saw no temple in the city because the temple is the Lord God, the Almighty. And so that promise of God's presence is not, God's promise is not place, but presence, and creative presence and new life presence. And so that connecting back to creation and then new creation here, the constant of that is God's presence, no matter where, how, and it's all for the sake of what God imagines, what God imagines things to be.
Wow. I appreciate that. And Karoline, I'm going to admit to all of our podcast listeners, I am so stealing that line, that God's promise isn't place, it is presence. Wow, I love that. And Matt, I appreciate your highlighting this from the garden to the city. One of the places that sometimes when we talk about urban and we talk about city, it seems like we're abandoning or forgetting or missing the value in rural. And one of the places that I lived, I'm originally from Chicago, so the city is home, but one of the places I lived was in Wilmore, Kentucky, where the population was under 5,000 people, and it was surrounded by horse country, horse farms. And it was in that little town that I also met the world, because between University of Kentucky up in Lexington and Asbury Seminary and Asbury College there in Wilmore, I encountered people from all over the world. And to this day, whether I'm in Kenya or in England or talking with my friends from the Ukraine, they are people that I met in this backyard of rural Kentucky. And so having the presence of God that is promised in Revelation, that is the city of God, is not an abandonment of the rural. It is just a recognition that this is the place where it's every nation, every tongue, every tribe, and all of creation in the presence of God, experiencing the peace of God's face shining upon all the earth.